So don't hesitate to, oh gosh, there we go. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have questions that don't get answered during our time today. As Alex mentioned, I want this to be interactive. I want you to ask questions. I want you to share ideas and perspectives. I want everybody to feel the richness of what storytelling can bring to the table, but I want you to feel like you got, a bang for your time here today. So don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask questions. Interrupt me if I'm going on too long, and I will be asking you some questions. So let's get started here. There we go. All right. Before we get started, is there anything that anybody particularly wants to learn about today?
I would say we're an organization that is more of an umbrella organization. It's a little harder to describe what we do because we deal in like connections and information. We don't hand out food. We don't have those kinds of programs. We do some rent and utility assistance through our Connect line, but just figuring out how to tell that story so that they understand what we do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Valerie. Anybody else have anything in particular that you want to come away with today? A challenge that you're having around storytelling?
This is Edward again. I'm not going to say a challenge, but I'm brand new to development. So I'm just taking this as a moment to just learn more and just develop strategy. So I appreciate what you are sharing with us today.
Of course. Thank you, Edward. Anybody else have anything that they want to walk away with today? All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So our job today is making storytelling the star of your fundraising work. Stories have always been a primal form of communication. We are physiologically hardwired to process information through a narrative format, i.e. through storytelling. And when we tell stories to one another, it lights up those endorphins that makes us connected with one another. So stories have a great job, and our job is to put it to work, right? Stories want to work. So in addition to the things that you see on the screen, authenticity, trust, we're going to talk about those things, leapfrogs over skepticism. It draws people in to learn more if the stories are told well. It ignites passion. It inspires us. It engages us. It really allows us to connect with others. And the remarkable thing is, we're going to talk in a little bit about the brain science behind storytelling. And the remarkable thing is that stories, effective stories, can help us change our mind, which is the very best way to get people drawn into your organization. All right, storytelling is not just storytelling. It has a lot of parts and pieces. And to do it well and to let it do its job, we really need to pay attention to all of these pieces. So first, we're going to talk about story gathering. And then we're going to talk about story crafting. We're going to talk about story listening, and we're going to talk about story sharing. So I think, Valerie, you mentioned that your stories are really hard to tell. And I think having all of these components will help you parse through that. I think it's also important to recognize here that the stories we want to tell always are about impact. How the work that we are doing positively impacts our community, individuals, people down the line. Valerie, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you shared your challenge here. But the fact that you do rent assistance, that you do utility assistance, that has a tremendous impact, not just on the household that you are supporting, but further down the line as you get that effect where somebody has the capacity now to, if they've had utility assistance, now they have the capacity to feed their children, to get their kids to school, and to go to work. All of those pieces are impacting the community. So I think we want to make sure that we understand as we go through our time together today to understand how interrelated the work that we are doing is and how stories can highlight that. One of the things that is important is to understand that stories are all about creating social change. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just prior to her death, told a group of young women, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And that's exactly what storytelling does. It brings people along our journey. I did a podcast a while back, and the guy said, you know, I think about storytelling, and my first thought when I hear about storytelling is, yeah, whatever. I also had a woman approached me. She turned out to later be a client, say to me, oh, you know what? I've been meaning to think about that. Storytelling, you know, I've been meaning to think about that. And we had a further conversation. We did some storytelling work for her organization. It was absolutely transformative. The work that we did together around storytelling allowed her to cohese her board, get her board better engaged. It allowed her to define a set of guiding principles, and we're going to talk about guiding principles in a few minutes, that helped them truly connect with why they were doing what they were doing in a way that allowed a national speaker to incorporate their story in his talk and take it around the country. So you never know how that story is going to, you know, yeast up, if you will, and get bigger. And so we have to be very mindful that story is not just an afterthought. I always include this slide in my presentations, almost regardless of what I'm talking about, whether I'm talking about strategic planning or whether I'm talking about, you know, organizational, foundational work or structure, but particularly when I'm talking about storytelling. Nonprofits are the stewards of our collective community goodness. Boom. And we need to be bold and visionary in the way we approach that work. And we need to tell bold stories that support our work, that support our impact into the community, and that open our hearts. And we're going to see why it is that that is so important, the heart part, the emotional part, when we get to the part about brain science. So to be effective fundraisers, we have to be effective storytellers. And many of you mentioned that you work in the development arena of your organization, right? So your primary job is to fund the work of your organization. And so we have to be good at not only the story gathering and the story crafting and the story telling and sharing, we have to be good at story listening so that we're telling the stories that our donors, our financiers, if you will, our stakeholders, our investors want to hear. And so all of these come together to make it important that when I talk about storytelling, I'm talking about it in a holistic perspective that includes all of those components. And we can't just tell any story. We have to tell a story of impact. We have to tell the right story. We tell the story that our listeners want to hear. And we want to tell an effective story. We hear all the time about telling a compelling story for our organization. Compelling is great. It opens the door, it opens people's hearts, but an effective story creates change. An effective story will move your listener to take action. And that is the bottom line of everything we are trying to do with storytellers. We want people to engage with our organization, to give of their time, talent, and treasure. We want them to advocate for our organization, and storyteller is the window in which we crawl to get that to happen. So any questions about any of that? Any comments, thoughts before we move on to brain science? All right, let's talk about the brain science. I mentioned it earlier. We are hardwired to process information through a narrative story format. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Before I do, I want you to take a look at this picture that I'm about to show you. And I want you to tell me either verbally or in the chat what you see. What do you guys see in this picture? Anybody see a bird? A parrot? That a yes? So the reality is that this is a woman in body paint. And you may have seen that. You may have seen this slide before. I see Valerie peering at her camera to see, at her screen to see if she can see what it is. If you look at the eye of the parrot, you can see that that's painted right in the middle of the woman's forehead. It's a lot more effective. I will say it's a lot more effective on the big screen, but it talks about the power of our brain to see what we want to see, but it's also talking about we can hear what we want to hear, right? And the brain is a really powerful tool for us in the storytelling world. So I say that it usually, I usually get a lot of oohs and ahs and, oh gosh, I don't see the woman. But this is a woman body paint. All right, let's talk about the amygdala. The amygdala is the middle part of our brain. So it's right up in here somewhere. And it is the part of our brain that makes all of our decisions. It also has no capacity for language. So in order for us to make a decision, we make all of our decisions on from our emotional cues. You probably have heard, well, I don't know, it's just a gut feeling, you know, or I follow my intuition, I follow my gut. Well, it's not your gut that you're following, it's your amygdala. The scientists at the University of Texas have done a lot of research on the brain science behind storytelling. And they have learned that we codify in language our decisions a full 7 seconds after we've made them. 7 seconds is a long time to intake information and then put language to it, which is why it's so important that our stories address the emotionality of the work that we do. And I don't care if you're a research organization, if you spend, I had a client that one time that was doing, it wasn't a client, it was somebody in one of my workshops, and they were doing work in the wetlands, trying to preserve, I can't remember what they're called, the meat-eating plants of the world, the Venus flytraps of the world, right? And they're like, there's no way we can be emotional about this story that we are telling, and yet we found a way. It's possible. So another piece of information that we need to understand as we become better storytellers is that we do not hear a story exactly as it is told to us. So however you craft your story, you have to understand that it's not going to land exactly the way it landed with you. Our brain sets out on a journey. As soon as we hear this story, our brain sets out on a journey to process it, to find relevant connection to that story, to process it in a way that's understanding through the lens of our own experience. So we do what we need to do in our brain, again in the amygdala, to process that story so that we understand it from where our experience tells us we need to process it. So I have worked in the past with a guy out of California. His name is Kendall Haven, and he's a storytelling scientist. And it's absolutely fascinating to sit down and chat with him and learn about the science behind storytelling. But what is so fascinating, I think, is that the brains mirror one another through storytelling. So if I'm really passionate about something and I'm telling that to Alex, his brain lights up in the same way, in the same passion centers, in the same spaces tied to my emotion and my passion. So it is how we change other people's minds. It is, as I said earlier, it is through that is the window we crawl through to change other people's minds about whatever it is we're doing. That energy, I'm sure every one of you have had the experience where you start to learn something you know very little about, and you get caught up in that excitement and enthusiasm as someone else tells you the story about what it is that sparks their enthusiasm and their interest and their energy. And you start to get excited about it too. Never knew it before. So it's fascinating how there is a scientific basis for understanding the work of storytelling. And all the work that we're going to talk about going forward through this presentation is about, is founded on that science of brain science and storytelling. So any questions about the science behind storytelling? All right, let's move on. How many of you are familiar with Simon Sinek? Just give me a yay or nay. No? Can we do that verbally? Because a lot of you have your cameras off and I can't see you shake or nod your head when your cameras are off. Yay or nay? Anybody
Not
familiar with
really.
Simon Sinek? Okay.
Maybe I've heard of him, but I don't recognize the name.
Okay. Anybody else?
We got a few no's in the chat and a little in the chat.
Okay, great. All right, Simon Sinek is amazing. Write his name down. I would strongly encourage you to look up his TED Talk called How Great Leaders Inspire Action. In it, he talks about that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe. And I will tell you, I've read all his books. I am a geeky fan. I'm like his #1 fan in terms of just the common sense that he brings forward. There's brain science behind what he talks about, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But if you understand that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, that is so incredibly true for your stakeholders, your donors, your investors. They do it because they believe in why you do what you do, not what you do. And to get to your why, he talks about the golden circle. So it's correlated with your brain. So why is the amygdala, that is that emotional decision-making center that has no capacity for language. I will tell you, his TED Talk is only about 18 minutes long, and it will transform your work. It will transform your agency's work if you choose to share it with your team. It is really, really powerful. I always have all of my clients watch this video. And I will tell you that I have stood in the room and watched people's aha moments more times than I can count. So I would really encourage you to to do that. The examples that he gives, I'm not going to go through all of them, but it is about really deeply understanding the work that you do and the impact that you have. And if your stories come out of your why, then they are going to be more powerful, they're going to be more impactful, and they're going to change the trajectory of the work that you are doing. So part of finding your why is defining your guiding principles and then using those guiding principles as the foundation of your story. So a lot of organizations have values. How many here have organizational values? Yep. What are some of them?
Caring and connecting people.
Yeah.
And
Innovation, maybe.
remember, definitely innovation is on our.
Yeah. So those are very similar. Transparency is generally on there. Integrity is generally on there. And I will tell you that those are exactly the same organizational values as Build-A-Bear Workshop in Whole Foods Market, which is not who you are trying to be, right? A set of guiding principles comes from what you believe. So remember I talked to you earlier about the former client that had the national speaker take their guiding principles and put them in his speech. So that happened to be for St. John's Church Foundation. And if you guys are from Richmond at all, you happen to know that that is the church where Patrick Henry gave the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And as we started into the storytelling process with working with them, the board was galvanized into two camps. Half the camp were about Patrick Henry and half the camp were about liberty. And it looked like there was a chasm in between those two perspectives. But where they came down when we did this guiding principle work was that they believe, start with, I believe, we believe that one voice can change the world. And when they came to that realization, the rest of the guiding principles came flowing out, and they really had a codified set of belief systems that were their why they were doing what they were doing. So for example, you might have a food pantry. Valerie mentioned we don't give away food, right? The food pantry guiding principles might be something like, we believe that our communities are stronger when people have their basic needs met. We believe that the well-being of our community is stronger. I'm trying to think of some of the others. An arts organization might have a belief system that we believe that art is integral to our lives. We believe that this particular artist has something to say and something to share. We believe that meat-eating plants have the capacity to influence science and change and potentially cure cancer. We believe that we don't just place kids with families, we create families, right? Your guiding principles are what you believe in your core. That is defining and finding your why. And that's imperative that you do that before you start the storytelling process. One way that I use to guide my clients into finding these guiding principles is an exercise I call throwing words at the wall. So you bring your board, your team, whoever's going to do this work together in a room with those giant Post-it notes on the wall, and you throw as many adjectives that define your organization: caring, responsible, compassionate, loving, whatever words you can find that exemplify your organization. Get those on the wall, and that will be the basis for starting to suss out what your guiding principles look like. Any questions about guiding principles before we move on to story gathering?
I have a question.
Sure.
I notice a lot of organizations, they have just single word adjectives, like you were talking about the activity, and it seems like they stopped there. They did the activity and they kind of, did a word cloud, and whatever word stuck out, that's what they went with. So
Right.
how do you move from, single words like integrity or transparency to, and let's suss this out into a belief that people can really latch onto, instead of just this kind of word that is,
That's a really great question. And it's hard. It's not easy because people stop before they've answered the question, right? And so it requires somebody who can facilitate that conversation and keep pushing them. I did that exercise with a client not too long ago, actually, and I said, we're going to fill 5 of these giant Post-it notes with words. And they looked at me like, and they got about 2 columns down, and they're like, okay, we're done. I'm like, nope, you got to keep working. It's kind of like the old game of 5 questions. Are you familiar with that one? So you keep asking why after every question. So the question is, my car won't start. Why? Well, when I turn the key, it doesn't do anything. Why? Well, you keep, because, ultimately you find out the starter's broken, whatever it is, but you keep asking why until you can't possibly ask anymore. It is about really setting aside your ego and setting aside your preconceptions. And it is about creating a vision for the world that you want to see out of what you're doing. Really, the guiding principles are more visionary than they are anything. I rarely suggest that a nonprofit have a vision statement. I think they're pretty useless. But guiding principles are the lens through which all organizational decisions should be made. So if you say that we truly believe that one voice could change the world, that's something to build on. Hard to get down to that level, and it requires a lot of sweat and sometimes tears to get there. It's much easier if you have somebody come in and facilitate that conversation so that they're not vested in the outcome, right? Like I have a client whose initial mission and work was about eradicating poverty. Well, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. Not in my lifetime, not in your lifetime, not in my grandkids' lifetimes. So what we started talking was about what kind of community do we want to live in? What kind of opportunities do we want people in this community to have? How do we facilitate that, having those conversations in that community? Question about understanding guiding principles, and it kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I want to make sure that we still have time to get to everything that we have today. So if the gentleman that had the question about the guiding principles wants to reach out to me afterwards, I'm happy to have a conversation with him. All right. It is not letting me advance. There it is. Okay, let's talk about story gathering. All right, that's the first step to storytelling, is we have to have stories to tell, right? So we have to gather them. We have to suss them out and find them. So where do your best stories hide? Best stories almost always hide with your program manager, with your clients, with the families that you serve. When you think about stories and sussing them out, it is about finding stories of impact. We're going to talk a little bit about story crafting, and we're going to talk about the fact that stories have to be small and little and one person focused, one person centric, and that they have to be about impact. They have to be about how you are changing lives. So stories happen all the time. But interestingly enough, very few organizations are intentional about sharing stories internally. I have a former client that had a monthly meeting. They'd have it over lunch. Everybody brought their lunch, and they spent the entire lunch hour just sharing stories. It gave the executive director and the development director new food for creating these impactful stories, but they did it intentionally. They captured them. So part of what your job is going to be is to find the stories, gather them up, and create a story library. And your story library can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet with 2 or 3, keywords that help you remember the story. But it's better if it's a broader library, so anybody can go out, and it's just an organizational library, then anybody can tap into that and pull out that story. You're also going to find stories in your CRM, right? If your development director is doing a good job of maintaining the notes that they take when they talk to their donors, that's a great resource for good stories, is in your CRM. Anybody else have any examples of where they've pulled stories from in the past?
We've got one down in the chat from Susan White that their programs provide monthly success stories in their agency board reports.
That's great. That's great. But I suspect that what could happen is that those agency reports just get filed and nobody's spent any time capturing those stories in a way that is easily accessible to their executive director, their president, to their board. You know, part of making sure that your board has the capacity to be an ambassador for you is to help them understand what stories they should be telling. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But having a mission moment at your board meeting every month is always important. I think most people do that. But giving your board members access to news stories that are a bit more involved than a mission moment is a really good idea as well. All right, let's talk through creating a blueprint for crafting a compelling and effective story. So what you're going to do through this blueprint method, the tips and tricks that I'm going to talk to you about, what creates a compelling and effective story. So a compelling story is you tell that story and people draw in and they want more information and they ask questions and they're excited to hear what you have to say. And an effective story is when they take action on that conversation. So as you are gathering these stories, it's like baking a cake, right? You gather the ingredients, the stories are your ingredients, and then you're going to take this blueprint and see how you can craft the language that is supportive of telling the story that you're creating. What's your number one rule? What's the number one rule of storytelling? There's a hint here.
I'm gonna guess it's make me care.
Make me care.
That's a really good guess. That's exactly right. That is the number one rule of storytelling, to make me care. So as you think about the stories that you have, you think about the stories that you want to share, the things that I'm going to talk to you about kind of will help you understand how to make me care. Rule number one, keep it simple, keep it short. We all know so much about the work that we do, and we try and craft. I will tell you, an elevator speech is not a story. It's not the time to tell your story. It is not, you don't want to cram everything you know into 2 minutes, 60 seconds, whatever you can. Keep it simple, keep it short. Rumor has it that Michelangelo was asked about his approach to sculpting, and he said, I simply take away all the stone that doesn't belong, and voila, a masterpiece, right? So take away all the extraneous information that people don't need to know. I'm going to talk to you about kind of what they do need to know. Make your story about one person, one family. Give your listener room to be part of the solution. We have a tendency to believe that our mission is so big and that hill is so big to climb to get to the point where we see no more poverty, no more hunger, no more, kids in foster care, that is so huge that we talk about the hugeness of it all. And your listener, the people that you have, that could potentially have a huge stakeholder role in your organization, don't feel like they have the capacity to be part of the solution. So you absolutely want to make sure that they have room to be part of the solution. This quote from Mother Teresa is excellent. If I think of the masses, I will never act. If I think of the one, I will. There's all kinds of marketing studies that bear this out. It's just, and I don't need to bore you with all of them. I'm just going to tell you, keep it simple and make it about one person, one solution, one opportunity to help. One dog, one baby, one family, one hungry kid, one kid in foster care. That's your story. People don't react to your story, they react to your story character. Remember, I talked about the amygdala earlier and how you have to have that emotionality connection, that emotional connection with your listener. The character that you create, the family you create, the let me tell you about this incident is going to be the one that they are going to identify with. Now, having said that, I'm guessing that there are more than a few of you who have confidentiality issues, right? So you're a 12-step program. You work with people in other ways in addiction. It's the foster care system. It's whatever, you're a battered women's shelter. Requires you to have that confidentiality and privacy. And you're like, but wait, I can't tell our clients stories because of this confidentiality. People are afraid to use what I call a compilation story. So you take bits and pieces of reality, the things that your clients are facing, the things, and we're talking, certainly in social services, but there's also the opportunity here to create a rich compilation story when your story isn't about direct services. One way that I really like to see an effective way, let me back up a minute, an effective way to create a compilation story is to create a third perspective. So there was a women's shelter sometime back. I can't remember what part of the country they were in. And the stories that they told were from the perspective of the dining room table. So they couldn't tell the story of the women at the shelter, obviously for obvious reasons, but they could tell the story from the perspective of the dining room table. It was quirky, it was fun, it was different. They talked about the change they saw in the women and the kids coming through over the time that they'd been there, the meals that they'd shared. It was really quite effective. Another organization heard that story. They were providing education in Haiti, and they told the perspective from the story of the town square tree where they held their classes under the tree. There wasn't necessarily a confidentiality issue, but the fact that it was so effective to look at that different perspective was powerful, and they chose to use it. And again, it was effective. So there's all kinds of ways to tell your story. I wrote an annual fund letter for a client last week, and it was about, it was a compilation story. But I told it about one person. I gave her a name. At the bottom, you say names have been changed. And I pulled a little bit of this person's story and a little bit of this person's story to make a compelling story that had certainly the basis of reality in it, because they were real stories They just didn't all belong to the person that I was telling the story about. So it's easy to create a compilation story if you're dealing with confidentiality issues. Be sure to include context and relevant details. So for example, if I say to you that Sally was able to go to the grocery store for the first time, that means absolutely nothing to anybody. But if I tell you that Sally was able to go to the grocery store for the first time because she has a service dog that mitigates the effect of her combat-related PTSD, then suddenly everything is in context. You notice I didn't tell you what kind of dog it was. I didn't tell you what she was wearing when she went to the store. I kept it short and simple, but you were able to create a picture in your mind, and you had the context and the details to do that. We talk about numbers tell and stories sell, and sometimes we hear that numbers numb, that we stop being able to pay attention when people start spouting numbers at us. That is certainly very true if your numbers are huge. If you are trying to talk about the magnitude of the problem, right? But you can use your numbers in a very specific way to say, so for example, X number of people live in a food desert, but let me tell you the story about Mary. She's a single mother and she's trying to feed her family and all these things. So you can use that data. It adds a richness to the story, and it adds a richness if you're telling a story in a different context. If you are telling a story in a board meeting, or you're telling a story to prospective funders, then it adds a richness and a context. Not so much so if you're telling a story to the guy beside you in the buffet line. To earn our attention, there needs to be tension. I told you I worked with the guy out in California named Kendall Heyman. We were doing a presentation together at a conference, and somebody, I can't remember how it came about, but they said, tell us a story where there's tension, and if you can't, include a duck. So he told the story of, anybody here remember the little golden books? Remember when you were a kid that had, the gold on the spine, and they were about 8 pages, and, Mother's Good Helper and all of that. Well, there's one called Where's My Mother? And it's the story of the little duckling who's lost her mother, and she goes to the pig, are you my mother? She goes to the cow, are you my mother? And she goes through all the barnyard animals, are you my mother? And then she finds her mother at the end of the story. Happy done. But there would be no story if she said, I can't find my mother. Oh, there you are. You have to have a little bit of tension in the stories that you tell. And the tension can be as simple as saying, this is really worth preserving. This is really worth our efforts to do this. We are all so caught up in our day-to-day lives. Creating tension allows us to drop a marble in their roulette wheel and pay closer attention. It doesn't have to be intense. It can simply be including your why in your story. This is why we are doing this. This is worth preserving. This is worth doing right. So add a little tension to the stories that you tell. And again, you do that across the board in any place that you share stories. All right, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about language, because language is important. We want to refrain from using jargon. How many of you have jargon in your industries? What's an example of some of your jargon?
AMI.
What?
AMI, area median
AMI.
income.
There you go. Or we talk about due diligence, or we talk about flagship programs, or we talk about, my all-time favorite comes from a former client where she talked about trauma competent parenting. And I have no idea what that is. Unless you're talking with another social worker, I have no idea what that is. And so, and I'm guilty of it too. I just use the term CRM, right? That's industry jargon. And we're all guilty of folding that into our everyday conversations, not just our storytelling, but our everyday conversations. And we have to recognize that we want to put our stories and the way that we talk about our work in language that is easy to process and understand. So leave out the industry jargon. We also want to talk about we and us. We want to be inclusive. If we are talking about you and they, it becomes divisive, and we want to be inclusive in our storytelling. So everybody wants to be a part of the we, right? And it helps, it's a psychological tool that helps everybody feel connected and engaged with one another. And another thing that we want to talk about and understand is how we show up and inadvertently demonstrate privilege. And I'm beginning to run into that a lot lately, because we talk about sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And all of those show up as privilege. The language, I look at so many mission statements, so many people who say my compassion, motivates me to take care of those less fortunate. My compassion helps me show up in these ways. And I don't believe the intent is to showcase that privilege, but that is the result. And so we want to articulate clearly that we see the inherent value of the work that we are doing. We see the inherent value of the clients that we are working with, and be careful that we use language that is supportive of that. I had a client not too long ago, and we started working, and I'm like, how do you feel about your mission statement? And they're like, oh, I love our mission statement. It's great. And my response was, I'm pretty sure it shows your white privilege. And they didn't see it till I pointed it out, because it said, it talked about compassion. It talked about lifting up those in our community that were less fortunate or had less resources. We just want to make sure that we are being mindful of the language that we use. And we want to make sure that we want to understand that when we change our language, it changes our thinking, and when we change our thinking, it changes everything. Another little language tip that you can use in terms of thinking, because we talk about donors, we talk about stakeholders, but really everybody who is involved with our organization is an investor. If I donate my clothes to Goodwill, I don't ever want to see them again, right? I'm not invested in the mission. I'm not invested in your why. But if I invest in you, then I have an absolute direct connection to the outcome and the impact, and I'm more willing to put my resources behind that. So just a couple more things. We want to paint a vivid mental image with your words. As I said before, we don't want to put in all the details, but if I tell you that Sally was a cute little blonde 6-year-old with pink sparkly tennis shoes on the wrong feet, you'd get a mental image. And then if I go on to tell you that she's one of millions of young girls who've been trafficked in Maryland, then it would be kind of a shocker to you. That creates the tension. You've created that vivid mental image. You've not put so much space and attention to all the details, but you have created in everybody's mind. Everybody on this call thought of their own version of a 6-year-old blonde girl with pink tennis shoes on the wrong feet. So make sure that you paint a vivid mental image. Stories make us happy. They should make us happy. Tell me what will happen and not what won't happen. I'll give you a perfect example. I was on the phone with a friend of mine from Dallas the other day, and we were talking about the SPCA commercial, which all of us turn our TV set off to when it comes on, right? It's awful, right? But there's a new commercial on by Subaru that's Adopt an Elder Dog Day. And she goes, every time I see that commercial, I want to run out and adopt an older dog because it's happy. It makes me happy that and it gives me space to be involved in the solution. Again, we come back to that. It's one dog, one person, one whatever. It gives you space to solve the problem. So make your stories, your outcome positive, and tell me what will happen and not what won't happen. All right, so all of our work, regardless of what we do, Valerie, even you say, you know, part of an umbrella organization and you do all these other pieces, every one of us in the work that we are doing, simply by the concept of being in the sector, we are creating social change. That's what we do. And stories are how we do that. It solidifies our place in the world and it identifies our common purpose. So speaking of common purpose, let's talk about listening. Let's talk about our stakeholders, our donors, our valued investors, right? So if we listen carefully to our donors, to our investors, they will tell you the stories that they want to hear. It is, so we've gathered the stories that we know we can tell. We've crafted them into a compelling and effective story that allows us to showcase our impact. And now, what stories do we share and tell? We tell the stories that our donors want to hear, right? And how do we do that? We listen carefully. And here are some ideas on how we can do that. Before I get into that, anybody have any questions of what we've talked about so far? Yeah.
I have sorry, I was finding
Yeah.
it. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So we have an opportunity to get a full page ad in the newspaper for Giving Tuesday. And it's like, how do you take such I mean, full page is great, but it's an ad. So how do you put a story in that, or do you, or is it more, I don't know, you know, we want them to be motivated to give to us?
Well, certainly pictures are a great way to do that. Visual representation is a great way to do that. And I would say my motto is skimming is the new reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
People don't read what you put out there. Like when you're going to do your annual appeal letter here in the next month or so, you're going to craft it very specifically so that you know people are going to read what's in bold, what's in color, what's called out, what's the most valuable space in a letter is the PS under the signature. So maybe, and there's a variety of ways you could do that, but yes, maybe make it a letter to our community. Always ask lots of times for that gift, right? And always call it a gift. People love to give gifts. So never talk about making a donation. You talk about making a gift. But yeah, I think it does require a story. That's a lot of space. Is it magazine size? What size are we looking at?
Regular newspaper size.
Newspaper size. Let me think about that, Valerie.
Okay.
I'll get back to you. Let me think about that. I'll get back to you. Let's connect after the class and we'll talk about it, okay?
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, let's talk about listening and connecting with our donors. When we change our thinking, it changes everything, right? So we have this, many of us, I'm not going to say all of us, but many of us have this relationship that we don't think of our donors as equal partners in our work. We think of them as our funders. Sometimes we think of them as a wallet. Sometimes we think of them as potentially a change maker, but not somebody to walk down the path and be on this journey with. So, relationships. When we shift our thinking from simply raising funds for our organization, and many development directors see that as their primary job. My primary job is to friend raise and fundraise, right? Then we can tap into the needs of our donors to show up on their philanthropic journey, to be a part of the work that we are doing, to be seen in the community as philanthropic, whatever their motivations are. And this is the part where we talk about how we suss that out. How are we going to do that? So relationships, as we all know, every one of us knows that relationships are the currency of capacity in fundraising, and stories are the currency of relationships. I mean, think about it. When we all get together in our personal lives, when we have family reunions, or we meet our college roommates for, you know, a mini vacation and drinks, what do? We sit around and we tell stories. That's all about relationships. Stories are integral to establishing trust. They help us create interdependent and interconnected relationships with everybody. And where does trust come from? Trust comes from authenticity. We should be shown every time as not selling our mission, but believing our mission, which is why it is so integral to come back to the guiding principles that we talked about earlier. And what is it that we really, really believe? That is how we start building trust, building relationships, growing our funding, by being authentic. And where does authenticity come from? Anybody know the answer to that?
Knowing your why.
Part of it is knowing your why. That's a big part of it. But another part of that is being vulnerable. It is about, if you show up as authentic, if you show up as vulnerable, then that creates an immediate connection that says this person is trustworthy, because look how much of themselves they are sharing. When I do training on board development, the best trait that I can tell you to look for in the strongest attribute of a board member is someone who can be vulnerable and brave enough to share it. So, you know, we don't often think about our stakeholders, our donors, our investors as getting their own needs met. What needs do they have? They have a need to give away their money. That is not it at all. They have a need to support the work that you are doing. They have a need to be seen as philanthropic. They have a need to be connected to a cause greater than their own self, right? And we never know what's motivating that. We never know what's motivating that donor to be philanthropic to our organization. And the way we get there is the reciprocity and the independence of that relationship. And it's through story listening. It is through hearing the stories that your donor tells, right? Organization wanted to build an addendum to their theater. Turns out that the donor's mother had been a dancer and always wanted to dance, and she died before she could ever do any of that. And so he gave the money in memory of his mother to open a dance hall for that theater. It is hearing the stories that your donors are telling. I had a client, one of the new board members is like, we should do a penny drive. We should make everybody give us pennies. And we're all like, pennies, right? But his story was, and this is for a food bank, his story was that he'd grown up living in his car. And he knew that people would not give folding money, but they'd give pennies. They wouldn't even give quarters, but they'd give pennies. And so that was the motivation for him saying that he wanted to do a penny drive for this organization. So listening to that helps the organization, helps you better understand what stories to tell that individual and build that reciprocity. What is our common purpose? Where does that intersect? It might range. If you are, say, for example, community garden, your interests might range from healthy food options for children, low income access to fresh foods, mitigating the distress of food deserts. But your client might only want to help with one of those, right? Only one of those might pique his interest. Telling stories. For example, there was a organization, I want to say it was on the West Coast, and they did a lot of things. They did education for children, they did fresh food for the community, and they did some child care, right? And one of the individuals, the development director, noticed that they gotten a check all the time from this one guy, and he'd upped his giving. And so he invited him in for a tour. He listened to this gentleman, and he was fine with the computer education, he was fine with the childcare. But when it got to the food provision, he was like all over it. And the guy's story was, he was a janitor at an elementary school, and he saw kids come to school hungry. And that was his motivation for giving. He gave over $9,000 that year after the development director had listened to his story and told him stories back about how that singular program made a difference in the lives of kids, because he knew that was the story that he wanted to hear. And you think about that. I can't imagine what a janitor at an elementary school makes, but I can't imagine that they have an extra $9,000 laying around that they're going to give to your food program. So defining that common purpose and where interests intersect is really critical to making sure that you're telling the story that your listeners want to hear. And creating that valued partnership that we've been talking about. All right, what's the difference between a story and a message? The story is the vehicle, and it changes. The message stays the same. The message are your guiding principles and your why, and that stays the same. I get asked all the time, shouldn't our board members all be telling the same story? And the answer is absolutely not. They need to be sharing the same message, but the story, the vehicle that they share it in, has to be the only story that they can tell. The story that led them to be a part of your organization. The story that made them say yes when they were asked to volunteer or engage or give money. It is personal to them, and that's the story they tell, infused with a message that you are sharing, which is exactly what we've talked about, your guiding principles and your why. All right, quick review. Sorry, my nose got itchy there for a second. All right, share impact by focusing on how it changed one person's life so that we can give the listener space to be involved. Bolster your stories with pertinent data. Tell the story your listener wants to hear, and tell the story that only you can tell. All right, any questions up to this point? All right. What message and story should you share now, and how do you begin? So we've talked about you be authentic, you be emotional, you be vulnerable, you inspire, and you tell the story that your donor wants to hear. So this sounds like a really long, storytelling should be such a major part of the work that you do for your organization, from story gathering, from story, making sure that you have them captured somewhere in a story library, and not just, this is the story that I'm telling, that you share them internally, and to then story listening and create that interdependent reciprocal relationship with your stakeholders and your donors. And one of the biggest questions I get is, how do you start your story? There's 5 quick ways to start a story. I can promise you that not one person will ever, if you say to somebody, can I tell you a story? They're not going to say no. They might say, not right now. I'm I can't do it right now, but I do want to hear your story. Let me tell you a story is the best, you know, it is like a chisel and a hammer to a coconut. It will open up the conversation and the dialogue. All right. As you work on storytelling and as you elevate that to a space of value within your organization, right? We talk about all the things that an organization has to do. And storytelling is usually not on that list. But as you begin to pay closer attention to the impact and power that story can have, you want to find ways to hone that message, sharpen that message a little bit for personable, relatable, and specific philanthropy that is collaboratively defined with your donor and that is built on the foundation of your guiding principles. As I said before, those guiding principles should be the lens through which every organizational decision is made and through which every organizational story is told. And the very last thing that you want to make sure that you do is that you have a robust call to action. Do not leave your listener hanging out there going, well, what do I do now? And your call to action can be something as simple as, can I send you an email? Can I introduce you to our executive director? Can I take you on a tour? Can I ask you to visit our website? But it could also be, can I invite you to an event? Could I invite you to learn more? Could I invite you to some other space where we could have a broader conversation about this? So always make sure that you end your story with some kind of call to action, because whoever you're sharing it with, you don't want them to go, well, that was nice, now what? So I wanted to make sure that we left time. I sped through some of that a little bit fast, and we can certainly go back. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes left in our time today, and we can certainly go back and pick up on points that we talked about. If I went too fast for you, Valerie, I'm still thinking about your question, and I want you and I to connect after this. So I'll get Alex to give me your email so you and I can have that conversation. But what questions do you have? What specific things will help you tell a better story? We're coming into the season of stories, right? Everyone is thinking about Giving Tuesday. They're thinking about their annual appeal fund. They're thinking about the holidays being a big time. No matter what work you do, this is the season of stories. So what questions do you have, and what can I help you with that will help make you a better storyteller? And I'm going to unshare my screen so I can see everybody.
So I have a question.
Yes.
In storytelling, should it mostly be verbal? I know you can do written stories as well, but should it mostly be verbal? And then if you do a written story, are there different considerations you have to make because people don't read, they skim?
Yes. So as I said earlier, skimming is the new reading. So when you do, for example, let's talk a minute about your annual appeal letter. I'm guessing that many of you have started it or are getting ready to start it. So it should, in writing, there should be pictures because it's very difficult to get enough adjectives in a written story that help you really pinpoint what that, the visual, the authentic visual of that. So people read stories in written format in the following way. They skip that. The first thing they do this is so weird to me, and I don't get it, but the first thing they do is skip to the PS under the signature. So that is where you want to reiterate the need for money and the call to action. Then they go back and they look at the pictures and they read the captions under each picture. Then they go back and they read anything in a call out. And then they go back in and they read anything in boldface or in whatever colored text you use, like red or whatever, so that you've created it to be noticeable. And then if anywhere in there they've caught your attention, they'll go back and read the whole letter. And some people will start by reading the first sentence. And if you've grabbed them with the first sentence, like the letter that I just wrote was, let me see if I can find it real fast. And I'll just tell you the first couple of pages that I wrote. Hang on. It was, first line. Krista had big dreams. She wanted to be able to pay her bills every month and have a car that was reliable. She wanted to have a safe place to raise her daughter, and eventually she wanted to go to school and get a better job, have a place of her own. Her dreams were so big, she had no idea where to start. And it went on from there. So I'm hopeful that that language was compelling enough to make people read the rest of it, to start reading. But I also know that they won't. So there's plenty of boldface and red and picture captions and a really profound PS. Debbie, in answer to your question, you have to have a very compelling subject line. Interestingly enough, people think of the subject line, when I say subject line, yeah, the subject line, you know, when you open your email and you see that subject line, you should generate maybe 100 subject lines for an email appeal, right? Until you get it down, it should be less than 8 words. It should be powerful. The best response I ever got on an email solicitation that I did trying to get people to sign up for a conference was, can we chat? And people thought I was asking them a favor, which was great. And they opened it and, you know, it went from there. Okay, what if pictures is really hard for us? So, I think that, so for example, my client that was the adoption agency couldn't use the real pictures of the kids that they were placing into foster care. So they used pictures off the internet. They used representatives. So when we talk about a compilation story, your pictures can be a compilation as well. It doesn't have to be an exact picture of an exact client that you're exactly helping. It can be representative of the work that you do. And my guess is, even if you operate out of a call center, that you have some way to showcase impact. And in that case, I would also be, in written form, I would be better, you would be better off pulling out language that showcases that impact, put a box around it and put it in bold red text so people will read it. But you can also use representative pictures. It doesn't have to be exact.
So there's a question in the chat from Monique that says, do you have a template that staff use to submit success stories?
I don't, because every organization is so different about what a success story looks like for them. You really just have to find out what's going to work for your organization. And I think too, the people who need to access those stories. So it could be everybody submits their story in written format and you keep it in a Google Drive, right? And it has, it's called whatever that story might be. So unfortunately I don't, because everybody is so different about how they gather stories and how they access those stories. and ultimately how they need to use those stories.
Hello, this is Susan White. Can you hear me?
I can.
I recently wrote a fundraising letter, and I started out, if one person can make a difference and influence the course of human events, how will thousands of volunteers create change? Did that catch you?
Yes.
Okay. And this is a 50th anniversary fundraising letter for our AmeriCorps Seniors RSVP program.
I think that's great. It might have a little bit more, it might have a little bit more impact if you used you in that first sentence. If one volunteer can make a difference, I can't remember exactly, if one person can make a difference, that person could be you. The more times you can use you in a written appeal letter, the more powerful and the more responsive it will be.
But the focus is on what the volunteers do, which is the reason why I used it that way. Let's see.
Is it going to your volunteers? Who's it going to?
No, it's not. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I'm trying to see how it changes the rest of the letter.
Well, what it does is what you're doing is you're asking the person that you're sending the letter to support the work of those thousands of volunteers, right? Yeah.
Right.
So again, you want to, might just be a subtle shift, and I think your language is good, but you want to use you. You want to capture the person that's going to be reading that letter and give them space to be part of the solution right off the bat.
Okay. I'll look at it. I'll look at it in that format and see about changing it up some. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question, if that's all right. I'd love to hear any advice, thoughts about social media and how to use that in getting people to your story, not necessarily like try to tell a whole story on Twitter, but
Right. Yeah, I think social media is about sound bites. I think it's about capturing attention quickly and profoundly. And I think the success in social media plays out in its consistency. I think that if you are going to be consistent on social media, you're going to pull people in. If you are random in your social media posts, it's not going to work. Any other questions that I can help you guys with? Well, Alex, thank you so very much for allowing me time to be here today and share my passion of how I think storytelling can change the world with all of you.
And thank you, Sue. I know I can say for my part, at least, this was an excellent example of a lot of the things you talked about, in that your presentation and your passion definitely came through to me and latched all these ideas into my head as well. So I really appreciated that. And I'm excited to see what I can do to put a lot of this stuff into practice in my own work. And I'm sure that I speak for a lot of us here.
I hope so. I hope that works.
Yeah. If there are any other resources you want to send out to everyone, just feel free to let me know. And for everyone here, we will make sure to send out a follow-up email with all of the information, with the presentation slides, with the recording. If there are other people in your organization who you want to share it with, then please do. I think before we hop off, I'm going to put that TED Talk link in the chat. So if you're feeling extra inspired, want to watch it over your lunch break, I know that's what I'm going to do.
That's great.
And other than that, I think that's all we've got for the day. And really thank you everyone for coming. And I hope this was highly informative. And thank you, Sue, so much for presenting.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Alex, I did send you a quick handout to go with the slide deck when you share that with folks. And I look forward to potentially seeing some of you in future classes, and always feel free to reach out to me. You can get to me through my website is suekindred.com, and my email address is kindredspirit50@gmail.com, or just sue@suekindred.com is also. All right.
Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.